Terrific Tuesday, January 7th, 2020. Hope all is well with you as you're looking at this. If you're looking at this on YouTube, please like, please subscribe, and please share this video with your friends, your family, or anybody else. If I didn't already say it, I am your man, your friend, your brother, Cordell Glass, and reading the Bible is vital. So today we're going to focus on 1 Kings chapter 7. Solomon also built a palace for himself, and it took him 13 years to complete the construction. This was after taking 7 years to build, 7 years to build the temple. So I believe it was in his 11th year of reigning as king that the temple was completed. So now it's taken him 11 plus 13, what's that, 24? So he's now been king for 24 years once the construction of his palace is completed. And at this point, he's probably about 33 years old, 33, 34 years old. I'm 33, so he's about the age that I am right now. Once he, wait, my math is off. 24 plus 19. Wow, yeah, he was up there. He was like 43, so he had me by 10 years. Some of you guys looking at this are probably in your 40s. So King Solomon was a very successful king, a very successful builder and networker at this point in his career as king, in his calling as a king, which is pretty awesome. So anyways, verse 2, one of Solomon's buildings was called the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. It was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. There were 4 rows of cedar pillars, and great cedar beams rested on the pillars. The hall had a cedar roof. Above the beams on the pillars were 45 side rooms. Sheesh, you talking about having some guests over. I mean, you can invite everybody, your cousin them, your auntie and them, your uncle and them, everybody coming over. Arranged in 3 tiers of 15 each. On each end of the long hall were 3 rows of windows facing each other. All the doorways and doorposts had rectangular frames and were arranged in sets of 3. Facing each other, Solomon also built the Hall of Pillars, which was 75 feet long and 45 feet wide. There was a porch in front, along with the canopy supported by pillars. Solomon also built the throne room, known as the Hall of Justice, where he sat to hear legal matters. It was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. Solomon's living quarters surrounded a courtyard behind this hall, and they were constructed the same way. He also built similar living quarters for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. From foundation to eaves, all these buildings were built from huge blocks of high-quality stone, cut with saws and trimmed to exact measure on all sides. Some of the huge foundation stones were 15 feet long, and some were 12 feet long. The blocks of high-quality stone used in the walls were also cut to measure, and cedar beams were also used. The walls of the great courtyard were built so that there was 1 layer of cedar beams between every 3 layers of finished stone, just like the walls of the inner courtyard of the Lord's temple with its entry room. Verse 13, furnishings for the temple. King Solomon then asked for a man named Hiram to come from Tyre. He was half Israelite, since his mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father had been a craftsman in bronze from Tyre. Hiram, also you can pronounce it as Hiram, was extremely skillful and talented in any work in bronze, and he came to do all the metal work for King Solomon. Pause before we go to verse 15. If you can recall, if when reading 1 Kings chapter 5, there's a King Hiram, also known as King Hiram, the Phoenician, the gentleman that was the king in Tyre. This is not the same king. This is not the same person. Not the same Hiram. Not the same Hiram. The Hiram of Tyre that we're speaking of here was a completely different person that was sent by way of King Hiram. And this man, as mentioned here, he was mixed. He was Israelite. He was half Israelite, but he was also half, I guess, probably Phoenician, I guess you can say, or Lebanese, Taiwanese. I don't know if that's even a word. It might be making it up. But because of his mixed culture, because he was more than one ethnicity, I guess it wasn't as popular in those times, unless you were a king and you were marrying women from different tribes. Chances are you probably stuck with people in your tribe that were part of your nationality. But Hiram's parents were mixed. They were from different. They were different nationalities. So he was multi ethnical, and this gave him an advantage. I know sometimes, us that are mixed, we feel maybe a lack of identity or a pooling. Trying to choose sides, whether we're black, whether we're white, whether we're Hispanic, or whether we're Asian, whatever it may be, we're kind of like mixed up in terms of what culture to choose. There's certain things about this culture we want. There's certain things about this culture we want. There's certain things that we don't want to be identified as. Some things we do want to be identified as. And all of that's understandable. But, I mean, obviously we don't get to choose our parents. And there's something beautiful about the mixing of cultures, the mixing of ethnicities. I'm a mixed, mostly, I guess, African American descent, but it's really, really awesome. There's advantages. I know that a lot of people find it to be disadvantageous in terms of just not really knowing where you fit in sometimes, but it can be a huge advantage. And for this gentleman right here, he was able to relate with the Israeli culture, so he served very well in terms of having, I guess, hints or notes or colors or flavors of the Israeli culture, but then he matched that with the Phoenician culture, the Lebanese or Taiwanese culture, and it made for a beautiful architecture. It made for a cool mix of art that you wouldn't get from a purely Israeli man or woman or purely Phoenician man or woman. So that's pretty awesome. I thought that was pretty cool, worth sharing. Verse 15, Hiram cast 2 bronze pillars, each 27 feet tall and 18 feet in circumference. For the tops of the pillars, also known as capitals, he cast bronze capitals, each 7.5 feet tall. Wow. Each capital was decorated with 7 sets of lattice work and interwoven chains. He also encircled the lattice work with 2 rows of pomegranates to decorate the capitals over the pillars. The capitals on the columns inside the entry room were shaped like water lilies, and they were 6 feet tall. The capitals on the 2 pillars had 200 pomegranates in 2 rows around them, beside the rounded surface next to the lattice work. Hiram set the pillars at the entrance of the temple, one toward the south and one toward the north. He named the one on the south Jachin and the one on the north Boaz. The capitals on the pillars were shaped like water lilies, and so the work on the pillars was finished. Then Hiram cast a great round basin 15 feet across from rim to rim, called the sea. It was 7.5 feet deep and about 45 feet in circumference. Massive, massive architecture here. It was encircled just below its rim by 2 rows of decorative gourds. There were about 6 gourds per foot all the way around, and they were cast as part of the basin. Sorry if you guys hear my kids. I have a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old. My daughter will be 2, I believe next week, 17th, and they're loud upstairs right now. So sorry if you hear them. Verse 25, the sea was placed on a base of 12 bronze oxen, all facing outward. 3 faced north, 3 faced west, 3 faced south, and 3 faced east. And the sea rested on them. The walls of the sea were about 3 inches thick, and its rim flared out like a cup and resembled a water lily blossom. It could hold about 11,000 gallons of water. Hiram also made 10 bronze water carts, each 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4.5 feet tall. They were constructed with side panels braced with crossbars. Both the panels and the crossbars were decorated with carved lions, oxen, and cherubim. Above and below the lions and oxen were wreath decorations. Each of these carts had 4 bronze wheels and bronze axles. There were supporting posts for the bronze basin at the corners of the carts. These supports were decorated on each side with carvings of wreaths. The top of each cart had a rounded frame for the basin. It projected 1.5 feet above the cart's top like a round pedestal, and its opening was 2.25 feet across. It was decorated on the outside with carvings of wreaths. The panels of the carts were square, not round. Under the panels were 4 wheels that were connected to axles that had been cast as one unit with the carts. The wheels were 2.5 feet in diameter and were similar to chariot wheels. The axles, spokes, rims, and hubs were all cast from molten bronze. There were handles in each of the 4 corners of the carts, and these too were cast as one unit with the cart. Around the top of each cart was a rim 9 inches wide. The corner supports and side panels were cast as one unit with the cart. Carvings of cherubim, lions, and palm trees decorated the panels and corner supports wherever there was room, and there were wreaths all around. So it's a lot of carvings of cherubim, lions, palm trees. There were pomegranates, water lilies, wreaths. These were things that were a huge part of the architecture, of the decor that King Solomon thought was nice, and so did his builders, I'd imagine. Verse 37, all 10 water carts were the same size and were made alike, for each was cast from the same mold. Hiram also made 10 smaller bronze basins, 1 for each cart. Each basin was 6 feet across and could hold 220 gallons of water. He set 5 water carts on the south side of the temple and 5 on the north side. The great bronze basin called the sea was placed near the southeast corner of the temple. He also made the necessary wash basins, shovels, and bowls. So at last, Hiram completed everything King Solomon had assigned him to make for the temple of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 2 networks of interwoven chains that decorated the capitals, the 400 pomegranates that hung from the chains on the capitals, the 2 rows of pomegranates for each of the chain networks that decorated the capitals on top of the pillars, the 10 water carts holding the 10 basins, the sea, and the 12 oxen under it, the ash buckets, the shovels, and the bowls. That's a lot of work he put in. Hiram made all these things of burnished bronze for the temple of the Lord, just as King Solomon had directed. The king had them cast in clay molds in the Jordan Valley between Sokoth and Zarethan. I think I said that right. Solomon did not weigh all these things because there were so many. The weight of the bronze could not be measured. Solomon also made all the furnishings of the temple of the Lord: the gold altar, the gold table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of the solid gold, 5 on the south and 5 on the north, in front of the most holy place, the flower decorations, lamps, and tongues all of gold, the small bowls, lamps, lamp snuffers, bowls, ladles, and incense burners, all of solid gold, the doors for the entrances of the most holy place and the main room of the temple with their fronts overlaid with gold. So King Solomon finished all his work on the temple of the Lord. Then he brought all the gifts his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the various articles, and he stored them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple. So I know it's like, oh my gosh, what is all this? What is all these measurements and naming every description of the decor in the temple and the palace? What does all this mean? I believe that I was actually talking with a friend of mine, Martiffany Featherstone, earlier today, and she made mention of something, and I agree. I was thinking the same thing, that I really believe that God made it possible or ordained it to be so that there would be record of in specific records of these of this architecture, of this construction in so much detail, because he knew that one day people would try to refute the claims of the Bible, try to call it non-historical, try to say it's a myth. And the reality is that even today, and over many years now, there has been archaeologists going into Jerusalem, going into the Holy Land, and doing, I believe, what you call excavations, I believe it is, and digging and finding ancient artifacts, finding these buildings, actually finding the palace, excuse me, finding the Palace of Solomon, which is believed to be on the north end of the city of David. These are places that you can actually go and look and see with your own eyes today that are the exact same description. Like, for instance, if something that was 45 feet, I can't recall, as we look red in here, something was 45 feet. Well, you can go there right now and measure that same artifact, that same architecture, and find that it was 45 feet. And so it's easy to dismiss the ridiculous claims of people that would say that the Bible is errant, that the Bible is fake, that's just a myth. Well, God made it possible for us to be able to, kind of like a time capsule, thousands of years later. I believe this, when they built the palace, this was back in the 900s BC. So 900 years before Christ is when this palace was built, and almost 3,000 plus years later, this architecture, these artifacts can be found today, and proving that King Solomon existed, proving that he dedicated this temple to the Lord, dedicated his palace to the Lord. I thought that was incredible. I'm gonna see if I can't drop a link from a video I watched earlier today, showing some of the architecture of the palace of Solomon, King Solomon. Another site, a holy site that I hope to be able to see before my life is over, on this side of eternity. What else stood out about this chapter? I would love to know your thoughts. If you guys would comment on YouTube or even on Facebook, wherever you would look at this video, share your thoughts, share your comments about what stood out to you in this this particular chapter of 1 Kings chapter 7. Something else that stood out to me was this last line here. Let me get back to it. This last verse 51. So King Solomon finished all his work in the temple of the Lord. Then he brought all the gifts his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the various articles, and he stored them in treasuries of the Lord's temple. So it was King David's desire to build a temple. It wasn't the Lord's desire for that to happen. And so therefore he had promised to King David that he would have his son, King Solomon, to build a temple in his name. And I believe in 2 Samuel verse 8, in chapter 8, rather, where it talks about the spoils that David was receiving from war. And all of these spoils, the gold, the silver, and the various articles, he dedicated those things to the Lord. And had it been the Lord's will, I'd imagine he would have taken those spoils that he dedicated to the Lord, and he would have put them in the temple himself. But King Solomon, being a very attentive son, being a son that cared about his father's legacy and the heritage of his father, he chose to hold on to these material goods that represented his father's dedication to the Lord. And he put those in the temple. He carried those into the temple once it was complete. So a question to pose is, what are some prayers? What are some wishes? What is the will of perhaps some of your ancestors, some of your predecessors that you're aware of, that they desire for you? Maybe they desire for you to be a pastor, or they desire you to be a preacher, or desire that you be a good mother or a good father. Perhaps they desire that you would be an entrepreneur, whatever it is that they desire of you. And perhaps maybe they weren't able to accomplish some of those things. Maybe they desire you to go to college and finish college. If it's your desire and your heart's, if you believe it's God's will for you to carry on the legacy or the heritage of, carry on the wishes and the will of your ancestors, your predecessors, your parents or your grandparents or your great-great-grandparents, perhaps it would be a good idea for you to consider how you can carry on their legacy. If they want you to go to college, consider it. Okay, does that desire that they had of you, does that match what you believe God has for you to do? If so, that's all the motivation you need to go get it done. I think every parent wants their child to do better than them. Perhaps your parents want you to carry on the family business. So perhaps you knowing that they desire for you to carry on the family business, you'll start to position yourself now, training, so that you can take over the business one day, and be able to carry on some of the same business practices, some of the same culture, some of the same physical things that they've even had in the business. Maybe you hold on to those things. Maybe there's a house in the family. You can remodel the house, keep it in the family, and pass it down from generation to generation. Just giving you some ideas, just something to think about. How can you honor your ancestors? How can you honor your predecessors? But it's always important to make sure that it's in the will of God, because some things that your ancestors, your predecessors desire of you, it could be good things, but it may not be God's will. So let's say if it wasn't God's will obviously it was God's will for King Solomon to build the temple. That was something that King David desired, and it didn't happen in his timing, but it ended up happening through his son. Now, in terms of these articles, the gold, the silver, the things that King David had dedicated to the Lord, let's say it wasn't God's desire for King Solomon to put those items in the temple, but perhaps to give those items to Hiram, who helped to build this, or King Hiram, who helped to build these edifices, these buildings. And so if that was the case, then I would imagine King Solomon would have been obedient to God rather than to putting these items in the in the temple to honor his father. There's some things that don't need to be carried on. There's some traditions of our ancestors, from our predecessors, that don't need to be carried on. And there's some things in their legacy, their heritage, that is maybe identified to the way they grew up, their culture, but it may not line up with the will of God. There's some things that you have been taught that you want to be able to carry on and stand as a spectacle that represents your family heritage. But then there's some things that you ought to let go of and no longer hold on to, because they don't represent where God is taking you. So just something to think about. Thank you so much for looking at this video today, and hope you're encouraged. Tomorrow we'll be back with 1 Kings chapter 7.